Okay, I will like to welcome everyone to the program today. I am Roger Chirac. I am the Executive Director of the Clark County Historical Society, and it's our pleasure to present this symposium for 2022. Normally my job is, when we're here in person, is to explain where the bathrooms are and the functionalities of the building. And since that's not possible this year, I'm going to keep it short and sweet and turn it over to Natalie to go through the logistics of this virtual symposium. So Natalie, please take over.
All right. Hello, my name is Natalie Fritz, and I am the archivist and the Director of Collections Outreach and Social Media for the Heritage Center. And since we are virtual today, I am helping run things. So I wanted to go over a little bit of the logistics for you out there that are going to be watching throughout the day. This is being recorded. All of the sessions will be available afterwards and will be emailed directly to anybody who's registered for this event. You can submit questions throughout the day to each panelist. We're going to have a question and answer following each session with the panelists. So you can go ahead and submit your answers in the Q&A, which you'll find at the, I believe at the bottom of your screens or at the top of your screen, depending on if you're on a computer or a mobile device. So you'll be able to answer your questions there, and we'll answer some of them live. Some of them will be able to answer your questions in the chat portion. But if you're posing it to the panelists, we'll make sure that when we get to the Q&A, we ask those. At the end of the day, we're going to have a session that brings back all of the speakers. So if you have any questions that you think of during the day that you would like to push to the end of the day, just make sure you label those as an end of the day question, and we'll save those for that final panel. The chat is enabled if you would like to message the host if you're having any sort of technical difficulties. And there was a phone number in your email that if you need to get a hold of, if you have any technical difficulties, that was for anybody if they had trouble connecting. The transcription is going to be enabled in just a moment. So you guys should see that. If you need to see the full transcript while we're going, there's a option to click more, and it'll open up a full transcript on your screen, and I believe it will minimize it alongside the speakers. So otherwise it'll just go along the bottom of your screen. A couple other things while I have you, since I am the archivist, I wanted to talk to you about if you would like to come here to do research at another time. The research library is open Wednesday through Saturday. And if you have an interest in the Civil War, we have quite a few collections that might interest you. A lot of soldiers collections, family collections tied to the Civil War. So we're open by appointment. And if you haven't been to the museum, we hope that you'll visit us. We have a wonderful, the entire museum is wonderful, but we have wonderful military collections. The second floor is our military gallery, and we have some great Civil War collections. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background of how this symposium ties into the founding of our society. As the 19th century drew to a close, there were Civil War veterans across the nation that were thinking about how their wartime experience would be remembered. And there were many GAR posts that were discussing how they would have preservation or relic societies to save their arms, equipment, and stories from the war. The Clark County members here of the Mitchell Post number 45 started the Pioneer and Historical Association. And there had been a midwinter fair, and they knew that there was others in the community that desired to preserve the past. I know our former director of collections, Virginia, always joked that it was probably the women that were pushing the men to get their cannonballs and rifles out of the kitchen and dining room. So they needed a place to send them. So in September of 1987, the GAR's Historical Society Committee met with a group from the Springfield Board of Trade, and less than a month later, in October 1897, the Clark County Historical Society was born. So we're in our 125th year, and we are the legacy of those veterans, still here today to collect stories of everything in the county, but we do have a large military collection, some of which you can see up on the second floor. The cannon that we have on the second floor was made in Virginia in the early 1800s, and during the Civil War, the Confederates stole it from the US arsenal. The 44th Ohio Volunteer Infantry captured the cannon during the 1862 Battle of Lewisburg and brought it to Springfield, where it sat for a number of years outside. Well, it was at the Ferncliff Mound for a number of years, and then it was outside Memorial Hall where many people remember it. And today you can see it full restored on the second floor at the Heritage Center. Another great part of our case up there about the Civil War is the Ralph and William Hunt collection. They grew up on the Hunt farm in the former homestead of Simon Kenton, who was an early pioneer in the area. And when the Civil War began, Ralph volunteered promptly and was captured at Bull Run in September 1861 and was imprisoned at Libby Prison in Richmond. Upon his release, he achieved the rank of major. We actually have his diary, a copy of his diary in our archives. The reason we have such a wonderful collection that includes their tent and other officers' items was that it was stored in the attic at the Simon Kenton homestead, which is now open as a restaurant. Things like that, we are told, did not generally survive. So that's a really rare piece that we have in our collection. And then you'll see standing next to the tent here, we have General J. Warren Keifer, another Springfield boy who was a general in the war. We have his papers related to his service during the war and his time in Congress. So we hope that you can come visit this in person if you haven't, and come visit me in the archives if you want to learn more. So I'm going to turn it over to Ski now so he can introduce our first speaker.
Yes, my name is Ski Shaner. Chairman of our little project that has been going on now for 12 years. Obviously, we're in a virtual situation today. I saw the headlines in our paper this morning that Clark County has 90% fewer cases this past month than before. So Lord willing, we'll be able to be live next year. We're really thankful that our four speakers have accepted our invitation and are willing to go on a virtual Zoom format, which is a little different, but we did it last year and we will continue to do it this year as well. We're honored beyond compare to have Dennis Frye with us today. Dennis is a longtime historian from Harpers Ferry area. He was a recently retired Harpers Ferry National Historical Park chief historian. I first encountered Dennis about 15 to 20 years ago at Antietam as he gave a seminar for and a tour of the battle with the Blue and Gray Education Society on how to study a battlefield. And that was my first contact with Dennis. And since then, I've heard him speak quite a few times, been on tours with him as well. He is a very highly regarded, high in demand tour guide. He's author of 10 books. The most recent one is this one's called Antietam Shadows, and his highly regarded book, another one called September Suspense. I would encourage you, after hearing Dennis, to run down and get one. I don't like to be a huckster, so to speak, but these are two excellent books that I have in my library and that I've had the privilege of reading. One thing about Dennis, he's an innovator. In the middle 80s, he began historic preservation for battlefields. He's the founder of the American Civil War Battlefield Trust, which later evolved into the Civil War Battlefield Preservation Trust. And now I think it's just simply called the Battlefield Preservation Trust. He was the founder of that, or co-founder of that is still viable, going today as a strong entity of raising over several millions of dollars and saved thousands and thousands of property of Civil War era battlefields as well. I could go on and on and on. He's numerous appearances on PBS, C-SPAN, History Channel, whatever. But I want to present to you Dennis Frye, and you can see on the front part, John Brown's Holy War is his topic for today. Dennis, behind you is one of the most phenomenal pieces of furniture I have seen in a long time, or any of us. Could you tell us about that, please, before you begin?
Well, first of all, good morning. It's great to be with you, Ski. Thank you for the invitation. I've heard about this symposium over the years. I understand this is, I guess, a decade plus one now that you've been going. I'm very excited to be a participant. So thank you for the invitation and giving me the opportunity. And looking forward to talking about John Brown this morning. I'm actually in my home. And the piece that you referred to that is behind me is a corner cupboard. I have very high ceilings in this home. The home was built about 1840. And that particular piece is a Shenandoah Valley piece, probably about 1830. And it's got a fascinating story that deals with preservation. When I was president of today's American Battlefield Trust, the chairman of the board, Tom Richards, who had been a previous president of the Nature Conservancy. What a mentor I had in Tom Richards, a man who ran the Nature Conservancy. He was helping us in our initial years with the American Battlefield Trust. And, we weren't making a whole lot of money at that time. Our membership was only around 15,000. Today it's over 60,000. So we were in our infant, or actually what I like to refer to as our teenage years. And every penny we brought in, we wanted to put right into battlefields. We wanted all that money to go into battlefield preservation. We wanted our overhead to stay as low as possible. So I could look a donor in the eye and say, we are saving battlefields with your money. We're not saving my bank account. And so at the end of the year, we'd had a great year. We had saved several thousand acres that year. We raised millions of dollars. It had been a very, very good year. And Tom came to me, he said, Dennis, he said, you really deserve a bonus. And I thought, wow, a bonus. I worked for the government before going into the private sector. We never got bonuses with the federal government. So this was a new thing to me. And I said, wow, that's incredible. He said, but I can't give you one. I can't give you one. And he explained why. And but it was very understandable. He said, your theory all along has been we've got to put all the money into battlefield preservation. So if I give you a bonus, it's hypocritical. And I said, you're absolutely right. That would not be proper. It would not be ethical. And I wouldn't be able to look a person in the eye and say the money's going toward battlefield preservation. So he said, I've got another idea. Why don't you come to my house? And I think you might like this as your bonus. So I went to Tom's place and he took me to, I admired this corner cupboard before. I'd seen it numerous times when I had visited with him. And he said, how would you like this as your bonus? And so that's how it ended up here in my home, an 1840 home. And I'm really glad to have it as the background to share today. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece. The setting that we have, my wife and I have in there actually is from the James K. Polk presidential collection. That's what he would have dined with. And it was reproduced by Winither about 30 years ago. So we've got the full collection that Polk would have had in the White House in the cabinet that you see behind me. One other point I'll make is that this house did have a very significant history in the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam. I'm not far from the Burnside Bridge. If we were able to hook on to the wings of a crow, I'm 1 mile south of Burnside Bridge. And I know many of you have been to Antietam, and so you're quite familiar with the battlefield. There was no fighting on my property. I'm right along the Antietam Creek. But this house, which was substantial at the time, it really stood out. It was a part of a 1,000-acre farm. General Burnside would make this his headquarters after the battle. So Burnside would be here for about 2 weeks, and in what is now my home. And Burnside's job was basically to have his corps and other corps of observation along the Potomac River to make sure there were no more rebel invasions. And so this is where he was based. He was making his decisions here. He's communicating with General McClellan from here. And we had a very significant visitor on October the 2nd of 1862, about 2 weeks after the battle. Abraham Lincoln had come out to review the Army and to congratulate McClellan and the Army for their victory at Antietam. And so McClellan's headquarters about a mile from my house. And the first person to meet the president as he was coming to visit McClellan was General Burnside, who was the most senior commander in the Army Battalion other than McClellan himself. And so Burnside began escorting the president towards McClellan headquarters, but this particular home was en route. So they stopped here and they met here. They actually conferenced, Burnside and Lincoln conferenced in my home. And it gives me chills. Even saying it still gives me chills. I've lived here for 30 years now, but I never tire of feeling the presence of this incredible man, Abraham Lincoln, who saved our Union, who helped us rid this nation of slavery. He was here in my home. And every morning when I walk on the original floorboards of this house, I know that Abraham Lincoln's soul, the sole of his feet were there. And he left a little bit of his soul here with me to inspire me every day. So it's the most perfect situation for a Civil War historian imaginable, and I know how blessed I am.
So John Brown's Holy War is your topic. So how would you define John Brown?
Well, how would I define John Brown? Now, I'm going to reverse this question for our audience, because I'm going to ask you, how would you define John Brown? I want you to think about this for a moment. How would you define Brown? You know, working at a Harpers Ferry National Park for almost 35 years, John Brown was a hot topic. Everyone, it seemed, came to Harpers Ferry. They knew about John Brown. They might not know anything else, but they knew about Brown. Brown died in 1859, but he continues to live in American history. He's very vibrant. It's almost hard to refer to John Brown in past tense. He's very, very with us today. And so Brown, for years, people would ask me, the visitors in National Park would say, well, what do you think of John Brown? And I have my Ranger uniform on, and I'm an official representative of the United States government. I work for you, the American taxpayer, and thank you for that opportunity for 3.5 decades. I appreciate that very much, working for you. And I would say, no, wait a minute. It's not my job to tell you what I think of John Brown. That's not why I'm here. As a Ranger, my job is to help you think about John Brown, to help you consider Brown in the place where Brown made and transformed America. So I would always throw it right back at the visitor who asked me, what did I think? I would say, no. I want to know what you think of Brown. And we would engage in this lively conversation. So that's what I want to do. I want to pose this question to you. What do you think of Brown? Now, there's a twist here. There's a twist. You have to define John Brown for me in one word. One word. I'm not interested in a sentence, not interested in a paragraph. I don't want you to read a book to me about John Brown. Tell me in one word, preferably English word, what you think of Brown. Now, we were a live audience. Boy, you'd be throwing those words out at me. But there was one other caveat that I would say, and I do this with groups. I do this with live groups when I start Brown programs. I would say, oh, incidentally, the word that you have in mind, if you shout it out, great, but nobody else can use your word. There's no duplication to words. You've got to have a backup word and a backup word. And so think about for a moment how you define Brown in one word. Now, we could flood Ski as our moderator with all these words, and then he could start repeating them. But I'll throw some out that I've heard over years of doing this that may be one of your words, These aren't in any order of priority, so don't think that I am scaling these or weighting these words. That's not what I'm doing at all. I'm just going to throw these words out indiscriminately. These are words that visitors have told me, that people at Civil Roundtable meetings have told me. So, you know, just a few, and probably one of these will be one of your words. Martyr, terrorist, hero, murderer, religious, anti-Christian. I count that as one word. We'll put a hyphen in there. Liberator, killer, transformer, meaning transformative, deserving. And when I hear deserving, what that means is he deserved what he got. That's what that person's saying, which was execution. Another word I often hear, and I'll count this as, again, one word, freedom fighter. Put a hyphen in that, freedom fighter. And then I'll hear miscreant. Well, who in the world is he? How can you be all these things? These one words. You know something? The key is this: Brown is all those things because Brown is what you think of him. It's what you believe he is. History cannot define John Brown because he's everything we just described. And so really it's all, what does the individual, what do you think of Brown? And notice I want to put focus on the word think. And perhaps even more importantly, I want to say, what do you feel about Brown? Because often so many of the words that come out of people are not intellectual, but are feelings about Brown. He evokes emotion. He provokes passion, Brown does. He is so animating a figure in American history. And as I said, it's very difficult to talk about him in past tense. It's as if he still is with us today. He is pervasive in terms of American history and how our country will change and evolve. And so I really appreciate you assisting me in defining John Brown. Now, you're probably still saying to yourself, well, Dennis, what do you think? How would you define Brown? I haven't given you my word, and I'm not giving you my word. At the end of this presentation, you're not going to know what I think of John Brown. That's not why I'm here. I'm here to help us explore him. And you know, if I told you what I thought of Brown, it automatically prejudices me. It automatically gives you some impression of me that makes you not listen, makes you not pay attention. Oh, well, that's his opinion. Well, you're not going to hear my opinion. That's not going to happen. In 35 years of working in the national park, talking literally to tens of thousands of visitors over the years who have asked me the question, what did I think of John Brown? Not a single one of those people ever got my opinion.
So what differentiates John Brown from other abolitionists then?
What differentiates Brown from other abolitionists? Brown was willing to kill. Brown was willing to use violence. Now, the abolitionist movement is based on Christian faith. The abolitionist movement is based on belief in the well-being of fellow human beings. And that's the point, is that abolitionists, of course, believe that the slave is a human being, not the definition of a slave, which is a slave is property. I mean, this is an abhorrent thing. It is very difficult for Americans, and for me, every time I talk about Brown, this is painful. It hurts. How can we, the land of the free, define a human being as property? How do we do that? Now we can say well, human beings had been defining other human beings as property for thousands of years. That is true. Legally defining a human being as a piece of property. But that doesn't make it right. Just because the law says that you're not human, I can own you, that doesn't make it right. So the abolitionists wanted to right this wrong. Brown was a strong abolitionist, as was his father, Owen Brown, who incidentally has tremendous Ohio association, Owen Brown. And so Brown had a lot of influence from his father in terms of abolitionism. And of course, much of it he gained on his own. He was a firm believer as an abolitionist and a practitioner as an abolitionist and involved, engaged in the Underground Railroad as an abolitionist. He goes to Kansas as an abolitionist. But this is where Brown differs from so many others, is that Brown was militant. Brown believed that enslavement in its own right was a form of death, was a form of murder. You don't have freedom, then you are being killed every day. A piece of you is being killed every day. So Brown believed that if necessary, to bring it into slavery, violence may be necessary. And in fact, ultimately at Harper's Ferry, he goes beyond violence. At Harper's Ferry, Brown declares war. He declares war on the United States of America. And so that's the biggest difference, is that so many abolitionists never would have gone as far as Brown. Even Frederick Douglass did not go as far as Brown.
So did the U.S. government federal decisions, did that radicalize Brown?
Radicalized. Now, you know, at the time of the American Civil War, nobody used a word like radicalized. This is a more, this is in our modern language, radicalized. We understand what radicalization is. We've had to deal with it in our own existence, both from outside the boundaries of the United States and within the boundaries of the United States. I remember growing up as a kid, a fairly small kid during the 60s. I remember the word radical. You know, we refer to radical people that opposed the Vietnam War, that were marching in the streets. These people are radical. And today we have a different perspective on radical. It's instead of on the left, we often think of radicals on the right. January 6th. For those who were willing to consider violence on January the 6th. So that would be radical in our American society. And so were decisions made by the federal government, i.e. the Congress or the Supreme Court, did these radicalize Brown? Well, they certainly angered him. They certainly made him mean. With regard, and they made it more violent. More and more decisions that were made in the 1840s to 1850s convinced Brown that the only way to end slavery was going to be through violence. He saw the government as abetting, as assisting in the continuation of this, what Brown thought was a horrible sin against humanity. And so there's no question that something like the Dred Scott decision in 1857 radicalized Brown. Absolutely. I mean, shortly after Dred Scott, and you know, you can summarize Dred Scott, which is perhaps the most infamous Supreme Court decision in American history. You can summarize Dred Scott as, in essence, that decision says the slave is not human. That decision basically says, it reinforces with an exclamation point, the slave is property. The legal definition of a slave is property. That's Dred Scott decision. And so Brown was just completely beyond himself after that Supreme Court decision. Soon thereafter, Brown actually goes to Canada, to Chatham near Detroit, and has a convention, a constitutional convention, where Brown and his fellow convention goers actually create a new constitution that eliminates slavery. And Brown intends to bring this constitution with him when he declares war on the United States, and he will enforce the provisions of his constitution over the United States Constitution. And so this is a direct result of Dred Scott. Kansas, of course, was a part of the radicalization of Brown, where Brown becomes a guerrilla leader and a very successful guerrilla operator in Kansas. But what brought that about? What brought that about Kansas? Well, of course, it was it was the whole idea of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and popular sovereignty. Let's let the people in the territory, Kansas, decide, Kansas, Nebraska, let them decide. It's the epitome of democracy. Let the people decide whether they want to be a slave state or a free state. Well, what was America's response? Well, we flooded the zone, we flooded the territory with anti-slavery people and pro-slavery people. And so all these people show up in Kansas who didn't live there to fight it out over what are we going to do with Kansas and Nebraska? Are they going to be slave or free? And of course, Brown goes out there and fights and is involved in quite a number of very important military actions against people who wanted to bring Kansas in as a slave state. And even small things that would have been small by American standards, you know, the Congress passes the gag rule, which doesn't even allow you to talk about slavery in the U.S. Congress. I mean, that's the law of the land. Well, we can't talk about it. We don't want to talk about it. It's too controversial. Brown was just disgusted with this kind of action. One more thing I'll point out was the 1850 Compromise. And I hope I'm not giving you a chronological listing but these are all things that affected John Brown, just like legislation affects us today. And it determines how we live. And we might like the law, we might hate the law, but it's the law of the land and it determines what we do. It's our boundaries. Brown detested the 1850 Compromise that brought California into the Union. But the biggest problem for him was the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act. This is what the South enacted. It basically got out of the North in response to bringing California in. Was the Fugitive Slave Act, and Southerners demanded it because so many by 1850, so many African Americans were seeking freedom and going north via on the Underground Railroad. And think about it now. Remember, the slave is property. So the property's disappeared. The property's gone. You want to recover your property. That's what the Fugitive Slave Act is all about: recovering what belongs to you, what you own. Now, again, it's disgusting to think about you and me owning another human being. It's repugnant, but that's the law of the land. It's legal to own another human being. And so they want their property back. And Brown felt that was the tentacles of the Southern oligarchy. That's a word that we've heard a lot of lately, oligarchs. Slave owners are oligarchs. They're the wealthy people. They're oligarchs. And so the oligarchs are, you know, they want what's theirs. It's kind of like the Russians, you want their yachts. You know, it's my yacht. I bought it. I paid $800 million for it. So don't take it away from me. It's mine. And so Brown was just disgusted with this fugitive slave law. And again, it helped lead him towards the opportunity to fight to protect those in the North who had escaped freedom. And he was willing to kill people, slave catchers, if they came into the North to try to retrieve these, what they call fugitives. So yeah, no question that our government, the actions of our Supreme Court, the Congress, helped radicalize Brown and convinced him violence was the answer.
So why is Brown still relevant today after nearly 160 years following Harper's Ferry attack?
Well, Brown's part of the American psyche. He's part of our soul. You know, he's part of each one of our souls. We all know the song, John Brown's body goes marching, you know, his soul goes marching on. Well, that's true. The gallows did not kill John Brown. In fact, it emboldened Brown's spirit in reality was much stronger than his body. The soul of Brown is lasting much longer than his heartbeat. And so it goes back to my point that I was making earlier about so many people coming to Harper's Ferry National Park. They all have an opinion of Brown. They feel something. They bring it with them. And what's interesting is, I used to love to do John Brown tours, public tours. Now, these are people I don't know from all over the country, especially in the summertime. They're coming from the upper Midwest and coming from the far West and maybe even Hawaii, Alaska. You just don't know. Everywhere they're coming into the national park. And I loved it. All these strangers in front of me to talk about John Brown. And I would get there early in my ranger uniform to meet the audience and talk a little bit about, try to personalize some with them, find out especially where they were from. Now, they didn't know what I was doing, but I was doing something that was going to be used by me with the audience. I loved it, Ski. I loved it when I found somebody from Massachusetts, that hotbed of abolitionists. Thought, okay, I put that away in my mind. Here's a family from Massachusetts. Good. And I hit gold if I found somebody from Mississippi on the same tour. Now, Mississippi was not a hotbed of abolitionism. It's the antithesis of Massachusetts. So I'm getting ready to start the tour, and I start talking to the public, and I go through my introductions, and I'll say, hey, what do you all think of John Brown? What do you think of John Brown? Now, remember, nobody knows anybody in this group of 40 or 50 people. They're all strangers. And before anybody could answer, I would go over to the Massachusetts family, and I would stand right there beside them, and I'd say, tell me, what do you think of John Brown? And they would. And words of praise would always come. Words I used earlier were like hero and martyr and freedom fighter. Well, in the meantime, out of the corner of my eye, I see Mississippi over here squirming on the bench. Squirming on the bench. They don't agree with any of these words. So I go over there and I say, well, what do you think of Brown? And they'll stand up and point at Massachusetts and say, what are you thinking? He's not a freedom fighter. He's a murderer. He's a terrorist. What are you thinking? This was in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, all the way up to present day. And so we had these very interesting emotional discussions, interchanges of who John Brown is with an audience, public audience in the national park. And he's still alive, Ski. He's still alive for all of us.
So why Harper's Ferry? Why pick that?
That's a target. It's a target. It's his first target. Now, you know, euphemistically, this is known in history as John Brown's raid. I refuse to use that four-letter word, John Brown's raid. My most recent book here, which is a book on Harper's Ferry, I was not able to write this till I actually retired. This is called Confluence, Harper's Ferry is Destiny. The government used to have a thing called ethics. And so you couldn't write a book while you worked at the national park where you worked, because somebody might say you were doing it on government time. So I was able to get this book out after I retired. And I have a lot of John Brown in here. The interesting thing is that I never used the word raid. It's war. It's war. It's John Brown's war. He attacks Harper's Ferry is the first battle in his war. Why does he come to Harper's Ferry? Well, for several reasons. We have weapons there. There are 100,000 rifles and muskets at Harper's Ferry, 100,000. Now, these aren't hunting rifles. They aren't sport rifles. These are weapons that we arm our armed services with. These go to the United States Army, the United States Cavalry, United States Marines. They're in storage here at Harper's Ferry at the United States Arsenal that's been in business since George Washington was president. And so Brown needs weapons if he's going to conduct a war. The other thing about Harper's Ferry, many of you have been there, most of you have probably been to Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry is right on a river, the Potomac River and the Shenandoah River. As you know, the reason my book's called Confluence is the two rivers come together there, the Potomac and Shenandoah Rivers. And it's right on the tip of Virginia. Potomac River is a border, of course, between Maryland to the north and Virginia to the south. And I'm not going to refer to West Virginia here because there's no such thing as West Virginia during John Brown's time. That came later on during the American Civil War. So it's all Virginia. It's Virginia that stretched all the way up to Wheeling and near Pittsburgh. That's all Virginia. Charleston down the other end to Charleston, that's all Virginia. Of course, on over to Tidewater and Williamsburg, Yorktown, Norfolk, that's all Virginia. Big state, big southern state. Harpers Ferry is right on the top side of Virginia. And it's only a 2-day walk from the Freedom Land, Pennsylvania border, Mason-Dixon line. So it's that part of Maryland where I live is the narrowest part of the state. Is you all familiar with Maryland, how it's a strange configuration. It's wide to the east where the Chesapeake Bay is. And then as you go west towards the mountains, it gets very narrow. At one point, Maryland's only 1.5 miles wide. That's it. That's our whole state, 1.5 miles. And so out here where we are, where Harpers Ferry is, it's narrow. And so Brown, who had his headquarters for this war in Pennsylvania, in Franklin County, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, Harpers Ferry wasn't far away. And that was slave country. That was where the arsenal was. That's where the weapons were. And so it was conveniently located for Brown geographically. He could easily get in, he thought, and easily get out, get back to Pennsylvania, and continue to stage his war with Harpers Ferry weapons.
So what was his master plan?
Well, the master plan was to free slaves, to free the enslaved. But I often hear a word with Brown that I didn't mention earlier. Some of you might have had this word in your mind. Lunatic. Crazy. Insane. These are words I've often heard affiliated with Brown. So people might say that Brown's plan is insane, to free enslaved, not just a few. You know, the Underground Railroad would free a few at a time, and it took a long time to free many, many enslaved via the Underground Railroad. Brown wasn't thinking in terms of just a few. He's thinking about mass liberation. He's thinking in terms of mass numbers. We have over 4 million human beings in bondage in the South in 1859. And Brown knows he can't free them all. That's not possible. But he's got an idea. And let me share, you might think of lunacy. Let me talk about brilliance. This is brilliance. And I'm going to relate this to something that we're all going to affiliate with in just a moment. So bear with me. Keep in mind, the slave is property, which means the slave has value. In 1859, in New Orleans, an 18-year-old male slave was worth about $1,600 on the auction block. Now that might not mean much to you. $1,600 by today's standards is money, but not a huge amount of money. But in 1860, the average American made $1 a day. The average American wage in a year was $300 a year. So one African American enslaved field hand, 18 male, in New Orleans, the cost for you, the buyer, $1,600. The average American makes $300 a year. You see that value? Unbelievable. Virginia, incidentally, is the largest slave breeding state in the nation. Now, I know so many Virginians, and when I say this, you just watch them melt in horror. Horror. You're telling me Virginia was a breeding ground for slaves? Yeah, #1 in the country. Virginia was in the business, and it was big business, lots of money, in the business of manufacturing slaves. That's what they did. And then they sold those slaves to Louisiana and to Mississippi and to Texas and to Arkansas. They were sold into the South. Virginia was the biggest manufacturer. So one reason Brown wanted to strike Virginia was he was going to strike the breeder. We're going to hit the breeder. I want to execute the breeder. How do we do this? It's all based on economics. Brown's plan is based on economics. You see, if I am a slave owner, and let's say I own 50 slaves, And let's make it simple. Let's say the average cost of the slaves I own is $1,000 per slave. So I have $50,000 invested, use the word investment, invested in slave property. All right. Do you know that 50,000 is worth more than my plantation? It's worth more than my plantation house. It's worth more than all the crops I grow on my plantation. That's how valuable slave property is. So one night I wake up and in the morning I go outside and none of my slaves are there. Not a one. They're all gone. You know, there's a word for me. One word. Bankrupt. Just like that, I'm bankrupt. And that's what Brown's plan is. Brown's plan is to go into the mountains of Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, and Alabama, and Georgia, and use this as a fortress. And then have these guerrilla parties, these small guerrilla parties that go out into the neighboring countryside, into plantation country, and basically become escorts, military armed escorts to help you away from enslavement. We will protect you. We will defend you. Follow me, and we will take you to freedom. So imagine all these enclaves, all these guerrilla parties all over the Deep South, night after night, escorting 20 slaves here, 40 slaves here, 60 slaves here, escorting them away, small parties, and helping them on the Underground Railroad go north. And every one of those strikes against a slave owner, that slave owner has lost their principal wealth. So the idea was to deflate the investment of a slave. In other words, if the property becomes so untenable and so difficult to maintain economically, it's like a stock. Your stock price goes way down. Ask the Russians about the ruble. It's the same thing. It's the same principle. It's the same economic principle Brown is using. And basically take away your property and lose the economic value of that property. You lose your investment and you're bankrupt. Brown intended, this is the brilliance of his plan. He wasn't going to have a migration of 4 million people from the South. He was going to reduce slave value to the extent that it no longer was valuable to own slaves. It was economic genius. And so this is my comparison to today. We through sanctions are attempting to economically strangle a country. Brown intended to impose his own sanctions on slave owners.
So earlier you mentioned Ohio and John Brown. So what part did Ohio play in the making of John Brown?
Well, you know, John Brown, people think of Brown as moving. He almost like a gypsy, moving from here to there, to there, to there, all over. Brown spent more than half of his life in Ohio. He lived 59 years total. He spent 35 years in Ohio. His dad moved to Ohio about 1805 when Brown was 5 years old. To keep an idea, Brown was born during the election that Thomas Jefferson would win in 1800. And so he moved to Ohio. He lived in Ohio. He was raised in Ohio. He went to school in Ohio. Eventually, as an adult, he would start to move to some other state, but he kept coming back to Ohio. And he established various businesses in Ohio. He had success as a tanner, for example. He ran a tannery operation. A lot of people like to present Brown as a business failure. You read book after book on Brown, and you'll see the word over and again: failure, failure, failure. I don't look at Brown that way. I see Brown as an entrepreneur. I see Brown as a businessman who liked to take risk. Now, when you think about it, most people who are businessmen take risk. They have to. You can't be conservative and not make money if you want to start a new business. So this is what Brown would do. And he was very entrepreneurial and very much risk-taking, and often he failed. And what I mean by that is that, for example, he was part of a land speculation opportunity in Franklin Mills, which is today where Kent is, Kent, Ohio, not too far out of Cleveland and Akron. And they thought perhaps the railroad would be coming through there, the canal coming through there, Cuyahoga River, all that, and the town was going to explode. So Brown went together with a group of other land speculators to buy enormous amounts of land. Great idea. And you know what happened? The same thing that happens to so many land developers today, developers. Ask developers about what happened to them in 2007, 2008. They borrowed all this money, borrowed capital to buy this land, to speculate on the land, and then we had the Great Recession. And it destroyed them. They went bankrupt. They couldn't pay the banks back. Same thing happened to John Brown. John Brown, time and again, was a victim of macroeconomics. The 1837, we use a nice word today, we call them recessions. Back in the 19th century, they called them what they really are, which was panics. They were referred to as economic panics. 1837 was this horrible economic panic in the country. And Brown had, and his cohorts, his partners in this land speculation scheme, all lost all their money. And so that happened to poor Brown over and again, it seemed. No matter what his business was, he would fall victim to some sort of macroeconomic disaster that was happening on a national scale. And so, you know, he was a shepherd. He had a large flock, a beautiful flock, well maintained. He was great at animal husbandry. He did cattle and had success with cattle trading. He was a wool merchant and had a lot of success there. But ultimately, something would happen on a macroeconomic scale that would take Brown and his cohorts down. And so he's been labeled a failure. But a lot of this happened in Ohio, these business operations, much of them occurred in Ohio. One other connection I want to share with you, Oberlin College. Oberlin College, of course, is a wonderful example of progressive education in not just America, but in world history. And you as Ohioans should be so proud of the legacy, the heritage of Oberlin College, especially during the 19th century. It was way ahead of its time in terms of how it thought of people. Women were admitted to Oberlin College, of course, and African Americans were admitted to Oberlin College. Extraordinary, way ahead of its time. Owen Brown, Brown's father, was a trustee at Oberlin College. Okay. And so again, there was an influence between Brown and his father. You don't hear too much about Owen Brown, but Owen Brown himself was a staunch abolitionist. Owen Brown, Dad's dad, was very active with the Underground Railroad. Owen Brown, Oberlin College. And so Brown had great influence from his father. His father, in many ways, was a great mentor. Now, we don't know what his father didn't live to see Harper's Ferry. His father did live long enough to see Brown engaging in Kansas. So he knew his son was fighting against slavery in war. But he died in 1856 and he didn't see the aftermath. So we don't know what Owen thought of his son after that. But I suspect he would have been proud of him at Harper's Ferry based on Owen's own experience as an abolitionist.
Obviously, there were major casualties during this attack. Is it true that one of the black men, a black man, was killed during that time? Yes.
Hayward Shepherd, an African-American, free African-American. I need to put that in quotes. Yeah, you could be a free African-American living in the South. There were all kinds of constraints and restraints on you, a lot of legal requirements surrounding you. So you felt almost captive, but you could leave Virginia. You were not owned by someone. You could make independent decisions about your livelihood. So Hayward Shepherd worked for the Winchester Potomac Railroad, and he just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when the attack began. And one of the bullets that was fired happened to strike him, and down he went, and it was a mortal wound. And so the irony is the first man to die in John Brown's war to bring freedom was a free African American.
Now, might be a weird question, but did Brown intentionally fail at Harper's Ferry?
Oh boy, I've heard that over and again. And some historians actually theorize that he did, that he wanted to be captured, or that he wanted to be killed. In other words, the martyr syndrome. I don't believe that. It's kind of like, again, to use a modern comparison that's so real to us today, it's kind of like President Zelensky. Zelensky doesn't want to die. He doesn't want to be a martyr. He wants to save his country. He wants to free his country. He wants to fight for his country. So you can't do that if you're a dead man. Brown did not want to die. He was willing to die. He was willing to give his life to end slavery. But no, he didn't want to be captured there. How can you determine that outcome? Just like Zelensky, how can he say the Russians will capture me and then I have a chance to speak to the world as a captive? There's no way to determine that. So I don't believe that theory. I dismiss it. I think Brown came to Harper's Ferry to succeed, meaning take some weapons, get the weapons out of there, and continue the war, and then bring about this economic warfare in the South against the slaveholders. So no, it's not a weird question. It's a good question, because it almost appeared as if Brown made bad decisions and he got himself trapped, and it almost looks like it was purposeful. Not at all.
So what created the greater sensation, Brown's attack or his trial?
Definitely the trial. In today's world of instantaneous communication like this, we know everything that's going on just like that. And so, you know what the form of instantaneous communication was at the time of John Brown? There were two things. It was called the telegraph and the newspaper. That's how you had mass communication. That was the only form of mass communication, the telegraph and the newspaper. And so Brown became a sensation after his capture, in that newspapers at all corners of America, north, south, east, west, John Brown was front page news. I mean, this man declared war against the United States. He attacked the United States. The U.S. Armory and Arsenal in Harper's Ferry was owned by the United States. He was captured by United States forces, U.S. Marines. And so Brown was a sensation everywhere. And the initial sensation was, this man is a madman. He's a madman. We sometimes hear that referred to today in what's happening. Madman. But that would change. There began to be a polarization. Imagine using the word polarization with America. Yeah. There began to be a polarization in the weeks following Brown's capture. And in the North, there was this swelling of emotion in favor of Brown, in favor of what he had done at Harper's Ferry, in favor of his effort to start this war to end slavery. And Southerners were appalled. They saw the man as a criminal. He had broken the law. He had killed people. I mean, the mayor of Harper's Ferry was killed during the attack. Other people were killed, civilians. Other civilians were killed in Harper's Ferry. And so, Southerners couldn't believe what they were reading in Northern newspapers. And as a result, the country became very polarized, very separated. I like to say that John Brown carved a Grand Canyon between North and South in public opinion.
Yeah, you must have read my mind, because the next question was about polarization. But let's go to the idea that how did John Brown's affect America's course?
Well, I think significantly. John Brown is captured in October 1859. Let's fast forward through time. September 1862, so almost 3 years later, the President of the United States is issuing the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Now, there's a direct connection between John Brown and emancipation. Brown was not there. He was not there to hear it or see it or be part of its issuance, but there's a direct connection. First of all, Harper's Ferry is located 10 miles from Antietam. Right. The Battle of Antietam gives us the Emancipation Proclamation. That's well accepted by historians now, that without Antietam, Lincoln would not have issued the Emancipation Proclamation. He needed that major victory on Northern soil, and he got it in September 1862, a mile from where I lived, at the Burnside Bridge, another Bloody Lane, and the cornfield, and the Dunker Church, and the West Woods. All those places where so many would fight The result of that battle, September 17, 1862, is the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. John Brown deserves a lot of credit for that. The other thing I'll give Brown credit for, and this may be new to many of you, is this. I'm going to postulate that Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States, does not get elected in 1860. Let me repeat that. Does not get elected in 1860 without John Brown.
Oh.
The ghost of John Brown. Why do I say this? It's pretty simple, actually. The Republicans were not going to win in 1860. The Republicans are a new party. They've only been around for 5 or 6 years. They're not going to win a national election. They are considered radical. What makes Republicans mainstream is John Brown. John Brown's radical act at Harper's Ferry makes Republicans look mainstream because what John Brown did was divide the Democrats. The opposition party divided. And we had a Northern Democratic candidate, you'll recognize the name, Stephen Douglas. And we had a Southern Democratic candidate, the current president of the United States during John Brown's attack, John Breckinridge from Kentucky. So we had the Democratic Party literally polarized and split. And that's what elected Abraham Lincoln, was an extremely divided Democratic Party. You wouldn't have had that divided Democratic Party without John Brown.
So what's his lasting legacy? What's John Brown's lasting legacy, would you say?
There are very few individuals that transform America. Few. Now, even a president can't transform America. He needs the Congress. The Congress by itself can't transform America. It needs the president. And so, it's hard to pinpoint an individual that transforms who we are. I mean, the Continental Congress was not an individual. It was a collective. Most of American history changes through a collective. For example, women's suffrage. Now we can point to leaders in the women's suffrage movement, absolutely, but they don't do this by themselves, and it takes 80 years. African American, the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King does not bring about change by himself. Brown literally transforms America with his act at Harper's Ferry as an individual. And he forced the nation, he forced the United States of America no longer to debate slavery, no longer to talk about slavery, but into taking action on slavery. And what was that action? It's called secession. And what was that action? It's called departing from the Union and breaking up the Union. And what was that action? It was called the American Civil War. There's no question that Brown is a powder keg that he himself exploded and hurled the nation into bits and pieces into the atmosphere of civil war. John Brown is so instrumental in bringing about the war when it came. And it's difficult to find another individual, one person, who had such a significant transformative moment in our history.
Apparently, Dennis, there are some questions coming in from those attendees. In my lack of ability to understand a whole lot about Zoom, I think Natalie's going to take over or read those questions and let you know what they are. Okay.
Thank you for the moderating. Thank you for your excellent questions. And I hope we were able to provoke people in this discussion, that people found it stimulating, fascinating, not only an educational experience, but one that was very evocative. So thank you, Ski.
I would say mission accomplished, Dennis. You
did
far above and beyond. So I'll stop my video, and hopefully this will work, and Natalie will take over. But thanks so much.
Pleasure. Thank you. Hi, Natalie.
All right. Hello. So yeah, there are a few questions that were put in the Q&A. One, you touched on it heavily, but the direct question was that if John Brown did not support a slave insurrection, but rather to slowly destroy slavery economically, what were the 1,000 pikes for? His understanding was that they were to be used in slave revolt until they could be taught to use rifles.
Well, that is correct. It was against the law to teach a enslaved person how to use a weapon. It was against the law in the South for an enslaved person to have a weapon. So Brown knew that the Sharps carbines that he had, or the Harper Stray weapons that he intended to take, were pretty sophisticated, and it took some training, quite a bit of training and discipline to learn how to use these things. And so the pikes were an intermediate weapon. They were designed to give you an intermediate sense of defense, self-defense. They were more psychological than practical. He did have 1,000 of them produced. They were in. He did have several hundred brought to Harper's Ferry. The rest of them were at his advanced post just a few miles north of Harper's Ferry, where they were later captured by U.S. Marines. But the pike itself was not designed to be a weapon of war as much as it was to help psychologically assist in the defense of oneself as they were attempting to flee from an estate or a plantation. Here, take this. Let's arm you with this temporarily, and we eventually will be able to teach you how to use more sophisticated weapons. Brown himself also would say that he had no intention of creating insurrection. Insurrection actually was antithetical. Brown knew that if he went out there and he caused a slave uprising, like a Nat Turner uprising, the government, everybody would come down on his back. He'd be a 100 man. So he was much more interested in a very slow moving guerrilla type of action, where he would strike in unexpected places and they wouldn't be able to keep up with him. It was a form of insurrection, but economic insurrection rather than let's go kill the slavehold, let's go murder the white people that own you. Brown himself, even in his trial, would deny that he had any intention of insurrection.
The next question is kind of tied in with your long career with the park. It says, there's always competition for land. What specific strategies are used to keep developers from intruding onto historic battlefields or historic lands?
Well, boy, that's I could write a book on that by myself. And I've actually had people ask me to write about my experiences in preservation. I am getting up there in age now, but I started this when I was in my early 20s to combat development on battlefields. It offended me. I mean, I felt so empty when I would go on a Civil War battlefield and it was a housing development, or it was a gas station, or I smelled grease in the air from a McDonald's or a Burger King. It just offended me. I hope it offends you. And so I was inspired. This can't happen. We got to stop this. And back in the 80s, we still had tens of thousands of acres of battlefield land that was unchanged since the time of the war. So we knew we had a chance, but we knew it was our last window. And it's a tough fight. Sometimes you have people that want to sell, that are willing sellers. And I love working with those kind of folks. And then sometimes you just ran into the absolute most obstinate, angry, mean people alive, who just wanted to extort you. They knew that you wanted it because of historic value. And so they would just literally keep rising. The price would go up and you'd come to a deal and then they change it. They throw that contract away and come up with another deal and throw that. They wouldn't sign the contract, in other words, and come up with another deal. And it just, this escalatory inflation, because they wanted to see how much money they could extract from our movement. And it was so painful for me. On occasion, I had to walk away from developers sometimes. I had to walk away from people that were just creeps because they wanted money. I don't begrudge money. You own the property, it belongs to you, and you deserve to be paid for it. But when it was purposeful escalation of price, inflation of price, to basically steal from me and my members to try to save this battlefield where Americans died, I had to question the patriotism of these people. So I had, everything from willing sellers, farmers, to absolute thugs, mercenaries, who were so greedy, and everything in between. So it was a fascinating experience. I'm glad I did it. Glad we had so much success. I didn't buy any of these battlefields by myself. All of you helped me. If you're American, if you're a member of the American Battlefield Trust, thank you, thank you, thank you. We have saved tens of thousands of acres. We've raised millions and millions of dollars because of you. And you deserve the credit for saving these battlefields. And thank you on behalf of our American soldiers who fought and died on these battlefields.
And thank you for sharing how people can support with the American Battlefield Trust. So people that aren't supporting that can look into it. One more question and then a comment. What was Brown's influence on his children, and how did they carry on his vision after his death?
Well, it's interesting. Brown's first influence on his children was actually in Ohio. Brown made his first commitment to the abolition of slavery. His first known public commitment was to his family, and he did that in Franklin Mills, Ohio. And he basically asked his wife and his three oldest sons to take an oath of allegiance, not to Brown, but an oath of allegiance to God, to rid this nation of slavery. So that was, we don't know the exact date. It was sometime between 1837, 1838, 1839, right about that time, that Brown made this personal commitment and asked his own family to devote their lives to the extermination of slavery. Now, Brown ultimately has 20 children. Many of them die infants. In fact, you have 4 of them buried in Ohio soil as infants at Ridgefield, Ohio. It had to be a horrible experience for Brown to lose so many young members of his family while he was there. But by the time of Harper's Ferry, Brown actually, in Kansas, Brown's sons, oldest sons, went to Kansas and fought with him, part of his guerrilla force. He actually had a son killed, Frederick, in Kansas. Brown referred to him as murdered in Kansas. And then at Harper's Ferry, 3 of his sons joined him. Owen, named after his grandfather, Owen, Oliver, and Watson Brown. And 2 of them were with Brown at the fire engine house in Harper's Ferry, and both of them would die on that cold brick floor, fighting for the extermination of slavery and following their father, doing what they thought was God's will. So the Brown family was very committed to what he was doing, believed in what he was doing, believed God had chosen all of them for the purpose of eliminating slavery in this land and making this a free land.
Well, thank you. The last one's not really a question, it's more of a comment. Said that your comment about how John Brown helped to divide the party and led to election of Lincoln. So the comparison to Donald Trump and his division of today's Republican Party was the comment that was made. And so I thought that's an interesting parallels that you can draw between all sorts of everyday things in the past. So that's the last of the questions. And I want to thank you for you and Ski for having it as a conversation with all of us. We're going to go to
thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you, and look forward to joining the panel at 3:30 this afternoon.
We'll see you at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we are going to go to a break now, a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 11:30, and I'm going to just have a little bit of background music for you guys while you're taking the break. I'm going to share my sound so you'll be able to hear that, and then we'll see you back here at 11:30 with Dr. Etchison.